Do we have some questions from the audience?
I just wanted to ask, and this could be open to everyone, something we haven't talked about, which is interferences with empathy in narrative. What is it? I mean, I mentioned narrative strategy in Jane Eyre, that Bertha Rochester is a kind of simply atmospheric character who produces horror in me, but that's because of Bronte, what's happened in the text. What I'm interested in is what blocks narrative empathy. As a writer, you understand this all the time. There are people who respond, hugely to what has been written, and there are other people, you read a review and you have no no idea how this person could have read the book and articulated something so foreign to one's own intentions. Not that intentions are what happens in a book. I'm not saying that, but I just thought, all of you, I would love to hear some speculation on what interferes with that empathetic process that everyone, I think, has talked about so well.
So there's a lot of work on this problem out there. I call it the failed empathy problem, as opposed to false empathy, where you go against the cues to get your empathy into the wrong place. So failed empathy just doesn't work at all. And there are so many explanations. The basic explanations that come out of developmental and social psychology have to do with identity. So that if there's identity mismatches and you perceive the character or the representation as being well outside the tribe of yourself, that may itself be an obstacle. And people have a lot of hopes that fiction is a device that can overcome that particular barrier, and sometimes it does. But I think the reasons are as multifarious as people who come to reading, that a lot of it has to do with disposition, individual readers' disposition, their competency as readers. And some of it has to do with familiarity with genre or particular kinds of challenging narrative technique. There's lots of things about narrative technique that can be deployed to get in the way of empathy, which Brecht knew very well when he was advocating that we do exactly that, that we disrupt an empathetic response on the part of audiences. So if there's a rich field in there, totally fascinating set of questions.
Thank you.
I can perhaps say something too?
Yeah.
To answer serious questions. Perhaps it's also important to distinguish between a quite intuitive form of empathy when you empathize with the narrative all along the flow of the discourse, and a more reflective empathy when you respectively think about what you have read and so interpret more in details while empathizing with the character, the voice, the context, etc. And there is a kind of permanent interaction between, according to me, quite intuitive, quite basic form of narrative empathy and much more intellectually constructed. Perhaps it would be interesting to use, for instance, Carsten Stoeber's difference between basic empathy and reenactive empathy, and how these two level empathy interact with narrative itself. It's just an hypothesis, and I guess there is some experimental work on that. Perhaps Vittorio has some clues to give us.
No, I have no particular clue to give, but one of the biggest problems that lie ahead when you're so crazy to launch yourself into the enterprise of trying to study empirically the reading of fiction, which, to be outspoken, I never dare to say so far. Also because of the idiosyncratic quality of the reader, even within the same reader, that transpired beautifully from Siri's talk at the beginning of this second leg of our symposium. So the Siri who wrote the novel when she was 13 is not the Siri rereading the book afterwards. And I might say that also the the quality of the experience one might entertain during the day can deeply affect the way you empathize with the novel you left beside your bed. And so you go back with to the very same book with a completely different attitude.
Yeah.
I mean, we desperately need to be normative. We need to find the bloody median of everything, but that's not how life works. So that's why I keep saying that we are looking at the world through a peeping hole, because I mean, life is dimensional, nature is dimensional, and we are forced to use category, high empathizer, low empathizer, but so it's very complex and difficult, and I think you guys have better answer than I can offer.
Thank you. Daniel Tahiti?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
So
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, hi. Thank you for your talk. And hi, Vittorio. Good to see you. Just two quick questions. I was wondering, how is it possible for our brain, this sophisticated organ, to not able to distinguish between fictional characters and real characters, real events? Because I mean, you said that there is a network in our brain, namely a default mode network, that can be activated over the course of reading fictional characters, and it can be activated when we exposed to real events. So how is it possible for this sophisticated organ that cannot distinguish between fiction and real thing? And my second question is...
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, please, sorry. I didn't want to, I thought you had one question, but you actually have two,
Okay.
so please ask.
I mean, my second question, I mean, I guess you partially answered my question beforehand, but if you have any, I mean, more elaboration on that would be more appreciated. So what are the differences, what are the similarities between the emotions that are elicited by the fictional characters and the emotions that are elicited by real people and real events? Are there any similarities between these two types of emotions? And thank you.
Thank you for your two very interesting questions, which tap onto very hot topics. First of all, one has to say at the outset that most of what we know about how the brain body maps reality is the outcome of experiments where reality is squeezed onto a computer screen. So it is fiction that we pretend to use as a benchmark of how the brain reacts to reality. That said, there are not many experiments where, for example, an experimenter in flesh and bone sitting in front of the participant to the experiment is displaying something, say, touch on her hand, and you monitor the brain activity, then you submit the same participant to a video footage of that very stimulation. And these kind of experiments are suggesting that the network being engaged is the same, but with a different intensity. The strongest being the one evoked by the stimulus in flesh and bone, by the physically real stimulus. I didn't say, coming to your first question, sorry if I didn't, if I wasn't clear enough. I didn't say that the brain cannot distinguish between fiction and reality. If that were the case, we would be all potential patients for a psychiatric ward. And luckily enough, this is not the case, at least not for most of us. First, the sharpness, the granularity of the instruments we are employing are still very coarse. So if the default mode network is activated for when I attribute quality to myself, to a stranger, or to a fictional character, and I see an overlap, however, I pinpointed that there is a different degree of activation segregating the three, you might say the distinction comes out of the quantity of activation in the different phenomenal situation. Plus, something that doesn't transpire by this kind of pinhole look at the brain is what's going on in the rest of the brain. So take the example of disgust. If you put me in the scanner and you allow me to inhale disgusting odorants, the anterior insula lights up. If you show me the picture of someone expressing disgust, the very same anterior insula also lights up. If you let me read a narrative where the fictional character is described as undergoing disgust, again, the same voxel light up. However, those same voxel in these three clearly, patently different phenomenal experiences of mind dynamically connect with other parts of the brain, you see? Because when you zoom in, you see what's going on in that particular part of the brain, and you can always make comparisons between conditions. It doesn't activate, it activates less, it activates more, forgetting that there is a whole brain being active at the same time, and the dynamicity of this connectivity, it sounds like a magic trick, but I don't think it is really. Explain clearly why when you see an horror movie or a thriller movie, when you see a house on fire, you experience genuine fear or you're afraid for the fate of the character, but at the same time, you sit quietly on your armchair. You don't run out of the movie theater screaming and reaching the first phone to call the fireman. Okay, so it's intensity, it's a different brain network, it's a different dynamic pattern of activation, it's a cognitive framing that most likely subdue the most Pavlovian-like reflexes that normally would be triggered in real life and lead you to agency to keep sitting calm. I don't know if I answered your question, but I don't think I have more to offer as we speak.
Perfectly. You perfectly answered the questions. But what about the second one? Do we have any time for that?
Sorry, I forgot. I thought I answered both. Can you gently remind me of the second question?
That was about the emotions that was elicited by fictional characters and real people. Are there any similarities between emotions?
Yeah. I think fear is fear, but fear is it's intentional, like Musil would say. Musil compares love for God and love for fishing, and language also complicates issues here. So we use the same catchword to designate a mosaic of bodily activation, gut feelings. We keep talking about the brain, forgetting about the rest of the body that goes hand in hand with what happens up here. We should draw this craniocentric view of the mind. The mind is not only in the head, it's also in my guts. And I have very distinguished colleagues that are specifically try to show all this connectivity. So we say fear, most likely part of the amygdala lights up when I'm afraid if I see something happening, an old lady crossing the street with a car suddenly arriving, and I'm afraid that she will be hit by the car. And it's also fear when I see the same scene in a movie. But again, in terms of connectivity, in terms of dampening top-down cognitive effect, we call it fear, but it's really different because the intentional object is different, reality versus fiction.
Okay, thanks.
Christiana.
Okay, thank you. So I would like, if I may, go back to the question of our emotional responses to fiction, and I think that fits very well to the question we just heard. I would like to suggest a distinction. So one is, I think we have several emotional responses towards fiction or fictional characters, but I think not all of them are empathic responses. So if I'm afraid of a character or disgusted, morally disgusted or amused, these are all candidates for emotional reactions, but not for empathic reactions. And so the question of quasi-emotions is, I think, usually focused on these kind of cases. Where the object of the emotion is a fictional character or seems to be one. But to me, it seems that when we start thinking about empathy, we have to phrase the problem a bit differently. And so if we think of cases of not basic empathy, but high-level empathy, or as Carsten Stüber would call it, a reenactive empathy, and if we agree that there is some sort of imagination that takes place in these processes, then we can think of imagining a character state, and if this person, for example, perceives, say, a red car, and I imagine that I see a red car, nobody would deny that my imagination is different to a perception. At least this is quite common to think that here we talk of a mental imagery and not of a real perception, so to say. Now, if it comes to the emotions, it seems that things get really muddy. And I would like to address that question to you. If I imagine being in an emotional state, which is different to reacting emotionally to an imagined character or anything. So if I imagine being in an emotional state, so what is your position here? Do you think we can't make that distinction we can make for perceptual states and we have just emotions? Or would you say, yes, there is a distinction? Imagining an emotion or being in an emotional state is indeed different to having the emotional state.
Perhaps I can add, since Vittorio wanted to answer. Yes, I think for me, empathy and immersion, so aesthetic illusion, to use an older expression, there are two distinct concepts. For me, the immersion, the state of immersion, has to do with epistemic feelings or epistemic emotions, these kind of affective states that carry a form of knowledge. You have probably something to do when immersed in the world of fiction, something like with feelings of reality, feelings of depth, feelings of all this kind of small experience, which can be characterized actually in affective terms, that give you the feeling of being in a world of reality, but implicitly you know that this is fake, this is and so it's something distinct. According to me, it's something distinct from empathy. It's a question of ontology of the mental states. When you transport yourself from the world of reality into the world of fiction, so you adhere to another reality, but the reality is not like the perceptual one. There is something like yes, an implicit depth or a kind of defamiliarization that make you know, at least implicitly, that you're in the world of fiction, not in the real world. And according to me, this has to do with the special category of feelings, which has becoming quite studied again in the present time in the philosophy of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's
if I could add
so my answer is
there's definitely an agency issue here with respect to being drawn into a given emotional state by a fictional character and imagining yourself in a given emotional state. And that agency issue, I think, if I have to translate it again in the nuts and bolts of the brain body, that makes a huge difference. So, I mean, we should always start from the lib, never from the Körper. The Körper is a kind of medium that, according to our aspiration, or you may call it a delusion, is to clarify what the lib is made of. But the lib is the starting point and needs to be the end point of the game. So we clearly can distinguish imagination from what is real, and it has to be the same in the brain, which doesn't legitimate one to, just because there is such a sharp phenomenal difference, that the two may sit in two distinct parts of the brain, because that's not the way the brain works. The brain systematically reuses things for a variety of purposes. So again, I must come back to the challenge of the one-to-one mapping between concepts and brain mechanisms. Otherwise, we are immediately back to phrenology, but we are doing much worse than the phrenologists, because the phrenologists, at the very least, didn't have the expensive toys that we make ourselves so proud of.
And I'll just chip in that these things, both in life and in reading fiction, transpire over time. So to take just the simple example of a fear response, you'll get a very fast, quick and dirty, nearly, reptile brain response that happens fast, and it may or may not mature into a cognitive awareness and analysis of the threat, and it may or may not be sustained into action. And these things are happening over things that are like 1/10 of a second or 1/3 of a second long. And in fiction reading or in film viewing, some of that same stuff is going on, and we're discarding as many of these stimuli as we are perpetuating some of them. And it's going to be different to each person. So the degree to which there's even a thing that we can hold up and say, is this fiction response the same as, and then we have the real one over there. The real one is incredibly variable and in many ways complicated. So the idea that, I totally agree, like, let's please not do one-to-ones. I feel the question of whether or not quasi-emotions exist is less interesting than thinking about what are the combinations of stimuli in art, in letters, that layer upon one another to create circumstances in which there will be intensities of perceived emotion that are sustained long enough for us to actually recognize and talk about them. Because we've got to admit that just both in our regular lives and also in our art appreciating lives, there's an awful lot of stimulus that we just let it go by. We don't ponder it, we don't record it, we wouldn't remember it to talk about it. And that actually addresses part of Siri's earlier question of why do things fail for so many people. And it's just like attention is a big part of the aesthetic elements that we have been talking about. Like you could zone out and miss a lot, or you can pay attention and then just get something that you remember from the time you were 13 years old.
There are limits to imagination. I mean, try to imagine to be startled. Would it be so patently effective as when you are startled in real life? I can't imagine being startled. Maybe Siri can do that because she's a dusker. She knows how to play with words. But it has to start from my own agency. I seriously doubt that I can obtain the same vividness of a real startle by merely sitting here and imagine myself start. It's impossible, for very good reason. Sorry.
Can I ask one last question? Or this is it. It's just, I know it's a can of worms and it's different, but I think this crosses all the boundaries that we're talked about. No one has mentioned dreaming. Every night we manufacture fictions of a kind. It is not, again, the question of agency is very different. You know, you pick up a book, you decide to read it. It's a voluntary act. It's very different. Nevertheless, there has to be some link to the fact that human beings, even when they're not literate, right? Even when they are not literate, nevertheless manufacture forms of visual, auditory, and even tactile fictions every single night. I'm asking you to generate thoughts for me.
Well, I think we discussed it with Anna in the past. Actually, we dare to draw a parallel between liberated embodied simulation and the immobility, almost paralysis, that characterizes dream, in the sense that during dream, and that's a bodily condition that put animals, humans included, particularly when we spend a lot of time living in the wild, to a series of dangers, but its adaptive value made possible that this habit was preserved in evolution. So this is one of the most vivid conditions that humans can experience, and it occurs when the body is almost entirely paralyzed, which means that many of the resources that normally during daytime are put in the service of preserving our life from the dangers and of life are so we lower the guard. We are not anymore on guard, and we liberate a lot of imaginative, simulative resources, and the system runs free, and probably without the burden to guide our body in the world. This produces connectivity, condensation, and all the weird things that psychoanalysis has illuminated. I think it has to do again with the body in a completely different condition. And now one hot topic in neuroscience is what's going on while you dream. And there are people, I was listening to a talk that Georgi Bouzaki from NYU recently gave in a meeting in Barcelona, where we dare to address the topic, the language of neurons. What is the language spoken by neurons, without reaching any conclusion, of course. And his point was that during sleep, not particularly during dream, but during sleep, and particularly so during the sleep of the fetus in the womb, there are stochastic movements that are produced by stochastic impulses being generated in the brain, which produces movement, and this movement through the sensory feedback day by day build the map of the body. So in a way, stochastic movements are the teacher, the trainer of the brain, which learns how to map the body and reality through this activity. Well, it's partly related with dreams, but not necessarily with dreams. It deals with sleep. Okay, I don't think I have anything to say about that. Sorry.
All right. I think this is the wrap up then.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to Thomas's talk today. He talked about all these people who knew each other and who communicated about ideas. And it's absolutely fascinating to think or to imagine what it was that they exchanged and how it made them who they were. So maybe we're like that. Maybe that's what we're doing. We're in a community here. We're not quite a research collective, but maybe we're getting there. I want to encourage people in the audience to write with questions, make new friends, or say hi to an old friend. And let's keep the conversation going in all the ways that are possible. We're so grateful that we were able to do this with the participation of everyone here. We thank you. And I'd like to give David and Vittorio the opportunity to say their final words too.
Yes, thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you very much to the speakers, who are also the authors, because this meeting was a kind of work in progress, because the original idea was a publication, and Hannah can certify it. So we will be in touch with you very soon, because I think the papers has to be sent at the beginning of January, but well, it will be another story.
I share the feeling of Hannah that, or the dream, the city was speaking about dreams, and the dream is that we can build upon this first meeting of minds and body and continue discussing these very fascinating and crucial issues from this really enriching variety of perspective and angles. And it is a real pity that we are here in a virtual space. So there's no space for a third time grabbing a beer or a drink. That would have been the best conclusion. But we can only dream of it and dream of a next chance where hopefully we can meet in person. So thank you so much also to all the people who attended this beautiful 2 days. Thank you so much for being with us, and see you next time, hopefully. Bye.